Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each episode of this podcast is either an episode with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's particular episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled STEM Diversity and Inclusion Efforts for Women of Color, a critique of the new labor system. This paper is written by Kimberly Scott and Steve Elliott. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, "There are sustained international efforts to increase the number and percentage of people of color who pursue STEM education and careers. These initiatives are most widely justified as means to provide human capital for technology companies, particularly for women of color, African American, Native American, Latinx, in the US. Far too many digital inclusion endeavors entrench women of color, sometimes unwittingly, in a labor system that treats them merely as commodities. As a result, women of color either avoid lives in computing or leave them. To display and critique some of the aspects of this phenomenon, we discuss it in comparison to the labor system of sharecropping in the southern US after the Civil War. We challenge those who fund, design, implement, and evaluate efforts at diversity and inclusion to see women of color not as commodities, but as agents with interest in social and economic emancipation and autonomy." End quote. If I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this paper uses the metaphor of sharecropping to problematize the new labor systems around STEM education and careers. As always, the show notes include a link to the paper, as well as other resources related to this that might be of interest to you. You can find a link to that in the app that you're listening to this on, or by visiting jaredoleary.com and go into the podcast tab. You'll notice many other tabs in there. It's because I create a lot of content, so check out the free stuff on there. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of resources related to computer science education, as well as other nerdy things that I'm interested in, like drumming and video games. So in the introduction, here's an interesting quote. It's from page 375. Quote, "Rather than focus on who does STEM and why, we invert the question and consider who does not do STEM, computer science in particular, and why not." End quote. It's a really important question to consider. So having previously taught pre-service and graduate music educators, one of the things that was often discussed in the class was the people who were in that school of music had a music program that worked really well for them. But when we asked students to think about how many people did you perform with who did not pursue music as a degree, and what's that percentage? And it's usually like 95% of students did not. So one of the things that we as a field need to really think about is not just what worked for us, but what does not work about CS for others, and why is that the case? So I love the fact that they frame the question this way, and I also love the fact that they are problematizing the field and the discourse in the field, because I think it's important that even if we are passionate about something and we agree with it, that we also think through some of the potential harm that the thing that we're passionate about may cause. Which is why in some of the interviews you will hear me ask questions like, okay, you really like this thing, but when would you not do that thing that you really like? And if we zoom out broadly, we're basically applying that to computer science as a whole and saying, well, okay, well, when is this problematic? When does this not work well? So that way we can think through how we might be able to fix that. Now, in the background section of this paper, the authors cite some reports indicating that the percentage of women who go into computer science degrees is really low, and it's even lower in computer science PhDs, less than 5%, especially if we look at the intersections of gender and race or ethnicity. So for example, less than 5% of African American, Latinx, and Native American women get PhDs in computer science and hold less than 6% of jobs in CS in Silicon Valley. And a very interesting stat on here in particular is, quote, "For these women, being in the workplace does not translate into leadership as they comprise fewer than 1% of executives, senior officials, and managers," end quote. That's from page 375. Now, the authors point out on this same page that the push for computer science and STEM often does not originate from social justice arguments. It has to do with fulfilling jobs. So even though many initiatives are trying to increase diversity of gender and race in the field, or in specific organizations, the ultimate goal is to find employees. And the author suggests that we need to pause and reflect on this because, quote, "Scholars note that from the perspectives of societal institutions and dominant culture, Black and brown bodies continue to have the status of mere commodities," end quote. It's from page 375. On the next page, 376, here's another quote. Quote, "If efforts to increase diversity in technology can be justified only by appeal to economic growth, then these attempts assume that so-called diverse bodies merely provide pepper for the workforce pipeline. To this end, the presence of the Black and brown female body benefits those, especially white men, who already have capital and power in computing. Computing education programs and initiatives targeting girls or women of color can be, and often are, designed and implemented for the ultimate interest of those already with wealth and power. Such programs enable a labor system for computing that poises women of color as commodities used to enrich others, end quote. Now, to make their point, they use sharecropping as a metaphor. Now, they point out that they do not think that the current labor system is exactly like sharecropping. What they are saying, however, is that there are similar features that we should probably talk about, and they use sharecropping to highlight some of the features. So the next main section is on sharecropping and efforts for diversity in computing. So here's a quote from page 376. Quote, "Sharecropping is a labor system in which a landowner allows tenants to live on and use the land to raise crops, often alongside the landowner, in exchange for a share of the crop yield," end quote. Now, after this, they highlight 3 specific things related to sharecropping that resemble some of the things going on in STEM and CS education efforts. So this has to do with semblance of desirability, constraints due to unquenchable debt, and differential effects. All right, so the first one, semblance of desirability. So the authors posit that sharecropping seemed desirable. It seemed like a way of future success compared to what was going on with being a slave. However, quote, "Black sharecroppers soon found themselves caught in a labor system that largely forestalled the possibility of economic autonomy, buried them in debt, tied families to geographic regions, and limited their opportunities. Being able to work the land did not provide them or their families the social mobility they imagined possible from a new labor system," end quote, from page 377. So if you think about the discourse in CS education, it's often positioned as how many jobs are available and how much you can make in those kind of jobs. Now, typically, to get into one of those jobs, you need to get some kind of training, whether that be through a 2 or 4 year degree or some kind of a boot camp. Now, having known some people who went into those boot camps or who have gotten degrees in computer science, these are often expensive. So if we relate it to what was just mentioned with the semblance of desirability, it seems like this is a desirable thing. However, if we think about the sunk cost fallacy that can come with the amount of time, energy, money, effort, etc., that would go into getting a position in a CS or in an organization where you are doing CS, it might end up resembling the desirability that comes with sharecropping. The next section is going to talk about the debt that relates to this and how it might be problematic. But before I talk about that, I want to mention one other interesting thing on page 377. So Kimberly Scott, the first author on this particular paper, organized a CompuGirl program, which I'll talk about more in an upcoming interview with Kimberly. But she has a book out, and I do recommend reading it. It's a very interesting read. I was fortunate enough to get like an advanced copy of it so I could prepare for the interview. And I'll include a link to where you can find the book in the show notes. But here's an interesting quote from page 377. Quote, "Former CompuGirl students have expressed shame at deciding not to pursue technical careers, while those who did enter those careers have noted disappointment that the organizations in which they work exacerbate extant race and class-based social hierarchies," end quote. So yeah, you might get a entry-level position in CS at some of these organizations, but there still might be some race, class, or even gender hierarchies that will present themselves once you actually get into some of the organizations that you might end up working with in CS. But going back to what I mentioned with the debt, the next section on here is on constraints due to unquenchable debt. So the authors mention that the way that sharecroppers worked is that, quote, "At the end of growing seasons, sharecroppers regularly found themselves in violations of terms, having allegedly produced too little yield, in debt to the landowner, and tied to the land for another season to pay off the debt." Now, how this relates to CS and CS education is student debt. So whether you're going into the boot camps or degree programs, there's often a lot of debt associated with it. Now, they try and promote it with high-paying salaries, or even having companies who be like, "Hey, we'll pay for your loans if you work for our organization for X number of years." And this might sound great, but it kind of ties you to the land, just like in sharecropping. Now, the third area in this particular paper is on differential effects. So this has to do with how, quote, "Freed women who became or were married to sharecroppers experience fewer social gains compared to their male counterparts," end quote. And, quote, "Freed women in the sharecropping system were subjects to gender and racial discrimination, were often viewed primarily in terms of their roles as mothers, and faced sexual harassment and abuse from landowners. When they could, freed women in these situations fled to preserve their lives and well-being," end quote. Both of those quotes are from page 378. So this relates to CS and the STEM field at large in terms of women of color facing both gender and racial discrimination. And especially in the tech industry, if you have kids and take time off or need to, be with your family, then that was frowned upon because some of these organizations have a tendency to only focus on your output, or if we were to use farming terminology, your yield. Now, again, the authors are not saying that this is a form of sharecropping. What they're saying is, hey, there are some features of sharecropping that relate to CS and STEM at large. So here's a final quote, and this quote is from page 379. It's a paragraph. I'm going to read the whole thing because it's really important. Quote, "We urge those who develop, implement, fund, or evaluate efforts about diversity and inclusion in computing and STEM to consider more than just the skills they impart. They should also examine the labor systems into which those with the newly minted capacities will enter. This requires discussion and articulation of concrete and meaningful long-term goals, and of how inclusion efforts and education programs legitimately contribute to them. Closer collaborations with historians and sociologists, especially those who focus on legal, political, and economic institutions, are in order. These scholars can identify past social systems that fostered oppressive hierarchies based on gender and race, how those systems evolved into current ones, and similarities between past and current systems. With better knowledge about the social systems in which they intend to intervene, those who design and implement inclusion efforts can better identify strategies by which people, and especially women of color, can emancipate themselves from systems of oppression. They can also better distinguish those inclusion efforts that truly aim at equity from those who use language of diversity and inclusion merely to publicly grandstand while otherwise enabling oppression. Granted, it is an open project to articulate principles by which to design digital inclusion programs. Nevertheless, all programs and initiatives should explicitly treat women of color as individuals with dignity and respect who can do far more than feed the other," end quote. So many snaps to that particular quote, especially the sentence on people who use the language of diversity and inclusion to grandstand. All right, so at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to share some lingering thoughts and questions and whatnot. So one question that you might have for me is, why did I share this particular publication? Again, I think it's really important for people who are really invested or interested in something to problematize it. It's okay for us to love computer science and computer science education while also understanding there are problems and actively working to resolve them. For example, I love drumline. I love performing in it. I love teaching it. It was amazing. But some of the instructional practices that I experienced, and unfortunately some of the ones that I used early on when I was modeling what I was taught, were highly problematic. It's okay to love an activity and realize the problems that are in it and try and improve it. So once I realized the problems when I was teaching drumline, I immediately worked towards trying to fix my own teaching and then coaching others on how to not teach in problematic ways. So one of the things that I really recommend that we, as a discipline or a career or field of study, or however you want to think of this, that we think through whose interests are being served by the push for CS education. In the way that we communicate with students and parents and community members, are we only talking about the benefits in relation to industry? If so, what industry are we tending to promote? And is that really kind of the industry that we want our kids to go work in? If it is, great. If there's some hesitation in that particular thought or response, maybe we need to talk about that more. And in particular, we need to think of what are the potential negative impacts of CS education if those interests are not questioned. For example, one of the quotes on the first page of this was talking about how 1% of women of color represent leadership positions in organizations that are primarily comprised of white men. So we really should consider, when might this kind of push for diversity be a new form of sharecropping? When are people or identities or intersections of identities just a commodity in the eyes of industry or the field? I'm hoping it's unintentionally positioned that way, but even if it's just unintentional, we still got to talk about it and still got to work through it, which is why I wanted to highlight this paper. It's got some excellent points to consider, and I hope it sparks a conversation with you and colleagues and friends in the field. If you enjoyed this paper, consider sharing it, consider talking about it on social media, or share this podcast. And make sure to check out the other podcasts on my website, jaredoleary.com. There's well over 100 episodes right now with a range of really awesome people talking about cool things that they do in relation to computer science education, and some solo episodes like this where I unpack some publications that I think would be beneficial for the field to discuss some more or learn more about. I hope you enjoyed this short episode on this short paper. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're staying safe and are having a wonderful week.